right, why don't we get started? Thank you everyone for joining us for this Policy for the People conversation on immigration. We are very excited to be joined by Professor Chris Zepeda-Millán, who I will now introduce. Professor Zepeda-Millán is an associate professor in the Departments of Chicana and Chicano Studies and Public Policy, and the director of faculty research for the Latino Policy and Politics Initiative at UCLA. Born and raised in the East Los Angeles barrio of Boyle Heights, Professor Zepeda-Millán is the first Chicano to receive a PhD from the Department of Government at Cornell University. His research on social movements, immigration, and Latino politics has been published in top political science and interdisciplinary academic journals. Professor Zepeda-Millán's book, Latino Mass Mobilization, Immigration, Racialization, and Activism, received multiple National Book Awards, and he recently published a second book, which examines President Trump's border wall, child caging, and family separation policies. So we are thinking, I have a few prepared questions for you, Professor, so we can go through those. And then the second half hour, I'd like to open up to questions from the floor and have more of a back and forth conversation. So let's start off, similar to the topic of your recent book, if you could talk to the current state of immigration policy and maybe summarize some key policies that we had under Presidents Bush, Obama, and now Trump.
Great. So since there's only about 6 folks here, do you mind if we really quick, I just want to know kind of what department or program folks are in and where they're from.
Yeah, Policy for the People, we try to bring more progressive voices to campus to maybe give some perspectives that we wouldn't necessarily get in the classroom. So we all come from slightly different backgrounds, but are excited for these types of events. So yes, back to first to start off, if you could summarize some of the key immigration policies under Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump, and sort of what the major issues are going on right now.
Okay, that's a lot. It's about 20 years. Okay, I'm just trying to think of the main ones. So I think it's important to understand that when we talk about immigration, we're really talking about undocumented immigration. That's kind of like the main primary issue. And immigration has tons of other policy arenas and areas and types of immigrants, but that's kind of the most controversial one and the one that the politics of immigration tends to focus on. And it may be hard to believe, but right when President George W. Bush entered office, the immigrant rights movement was actually pretty excited because you had Democrats in Congress who were supportive of immigration reform, supportive of legalization, and you had a Republican president who just took office, who historically made, I think his first meeting was with the president of Mexico. He had been in talks with the president of Mexico to grant a massive legalization program as well as a guest worker program. So you kind of had this interesting combination of where the leader of the Republican Party, which historically had been the more nativist of the two political parties, was open to immigration reform. He was coming from Texas, where he had wide Latino support. He's a businessman, so he knew and talked about how important immigrants were to the economy. He kind of stood away from a lot of the kind of racial, cultural issues. He didn't really fall into the whole the inaccurate arguments that immigrants are bad for the country, for the economy, et cetera, et cetera. His state was thriving on immigrant labor, so it was a very unique kind of president. So there was all this talk, all this hope for national immigration reform and a kind of a left-right coalition between business-minded Republicans and more social justice-minded Democrats in Congress. And then 9/11 happened. Right, 9/11 basically closed any policy window that was open for immigration reform because you saw a huge wave of anti-immigrant sentiment, nativism, really take over the entire country, right? So it made it hard for the kind of more free market business wing of the Republican Party, which is pro-immigration. And being pro-immigration is different than being pro-immigrant, and we could talk about that later, but they're pro-immigration. And it kind of closed the opportunity and for them to say immigration isn't a problem, because immediately you got a whole bunch of fake news saying, oh, where were these people coming from? They probably snuck in through the Mexican border, right? anti-immigrant activists and the anti-immigrant movement saw it as an amazing opportunity for them to really point out and say, like, see, immigrants are the problem. They attacked us. They want to hurt us. They kill us. You know, they quote unquote hate our freedom, right? And they smartly were able to kind of initially take that anger and that nativist sentiment that was targeted towards Arab and Muslim immigrants and kind of expand the bubble to also include Latino immigrants as well. So within weeks, we started seeing raids all over the country, places like Los Angeles International Airport, where Latino janitors are being rounded up, and you know, deportation campaigns are happening. You know, in front of churches, schools, clinics, immigration raids and checkpoints were happening all over the country. Right, so you know, the kind of political opportunity for immigration reform really kind of shut down, and 9/11 really killed any hopes of any even discussion of immigration reform, because both political parties now didn't want to be labeled as, you know, as anti-American or pro-terrorist, right? Because there was a lot. I know it's hard for a lot of you to kind of understand because you might have been too young, but there was a lot of misinformation going on right after September 11th. You know, where they came from, how now we know that they all came in, you know, through legal ports of entry. No, none of them came in. None of the, you know, terrorist attackers came in through the Mexican border. None of them were, you know, undocumented immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. So that really set any momentum for immigration reform or comprehensive immigration reform back, you know, for years. That also opened up an opportunity, not just in the policy world, but in the grassroots world, for the anti-immigrant movement to mobilize. So you also have the rise of a group, militia groups along the border, most famously the Minutemen militias, that are literally hunting undocumented immigrants, armed. You know, there are armed patrols going through the deserts trying to find immigrants, cases of them beating them, a lot of racist kind of rhetoric and video recordings of their anti-Mexican and Latino rhetoric when all of this was happening. So you kind of had this anti-immigrant policy and anti-immigrant kind of grassroots movement happening at the same time under the George W. Bush administration. That not until towards the end of the Bush administration do you see immigrant communities start organizing little by little again. And one of the main kind of sparks of that was a very anti-immigrant, draconian anti-immigrant law in 2005 that passed the House of Representatives called the Sensenbrenner Bill, HR 4437. And that really just captured the sentiment of the moment. Again, we were still living in a very anti-immigrant sentiment across the country, but the Sensenbrenner Bill, basically, you know, right now to be undocumented is a civil violation in the United States. So it's like jaywalking or getting a parking ticket. Right? You wouldn't know that given the rhetoric, but that's really the degree of a violation, that it's a civil infraction. Right? What the Sensenbrenner Bill proposed to do is to make undocumented immigrants into felons, just like murderers and rapists. All right, and additionally, in addition to a whole bunch of other border militarization policies it promised to enact, it also is going to criminalize anyone who interacted with immigrants in any ways. So if you owned a restaurant and you sold food to an undocumented immigrant, if you're a priest and you know you give the host at mass to an undocumented immigrant, if you're a teacher and you don't, you know, check all of your students' papers, you know, and or report anyone that you think might be undocumented, right? It basically would have fined any American who interacted with undocumented immigrants in the most basic ways. It would have fined them thousands of dollars and potentially put them in prison. Right? It's a super draconian law, and that was one of the things that helped spark the largest mass mobilizations by immigrants anywhere in world history, and definitely in US history, which was the 2006 immigrant rights protest wave that occurred and that I write about in my first book. And that's where you kind of, for the first time since 9/11, say immigrants who had been under attack since September really kind of push back and be like, this is too far, you know, we're not going to take it anymore. Right. Unfortunately, as that year closed off, the immigrant rights movement was able to stop the Sensenbrenner Bill from passing. But again, given the anti-immigrant climate, you know, Democrats and Republicans were like, okay, we're not going to pass the Sensenbrenner Bill, but, you know, we still need border security so that there's no terrorist attacks again. right? So one major piece of legislation passed under George W. Bush was a Secure Fence Act that President Biden, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, it was bipartisan, they all voted for this, and it proposed to construct sections of the wall along the border, increase border militarization. In addition, before that, right after 9/11, I should mention, which is a major change, is that the Department of Homeland Security and ICE were created. They did not exist before 9/11, right? So this was also a major change that happened of the way we restructured. For the first time institutionally, immigration historically has been housed under the Labor Department, under the Justice Department. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security for the first time institutionally put immigration under a Homeland Security. All right, so now it was seen as a kind of terrorist national security issue, no more as a justice issue, no more as a labor issue. Right, so I think, and there's a whole bunch of other little minor policies that were passed that had some negative consequences that I talk about in my newest book in terms of border militarization. Right, so in response to all of this, President Obama, who was one of, if not, the most progressive Democratic candidates at the time, with a history of community organizing, with a specific foundation, I believe it was Atlantic Philanthropies that he worked with, was also one of the biggest funders of pro-immigrant organizing. Right, so a lot of people had hope for President Obama, and he promised, to try to push immigration reform in the first year. Right, and he did. He tried to do it as soon as he got elected. The problem was, and I think this is important for everybody to understand, especially given the current makeup of the Senate, is that, when people say Obama didn't follow through with his promise to pass immigration reform, it's not that they didn't try, it's that the Democrats never had the filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. I think they technically had won 60 votes, and then you see Senator Al Franklin's election was contested, and that wasn't resolved until I think November, December of the following year. You had Joe Lieberman, who was a right-wing Democrat, who basically held the Democratic Party hostage by threatening to always vote with Republicans. You had Obama's biggest ally and probably the most powerful senator when it comes to immigration, Ted Kennedy, get diagnosed with brain cancer and then be put in hospital and never leave again. And then his seat was lost to a Republican in Massachusetts, right? So basically the only way Obama could have passed immigration reform would have been by getting some Republicans on board, which all of them refused to do, right? So he decided to use a little capital he had on healthcare reform, which also was a big mess and had to compromise a lot in order to try to get some support. And ultimately they weren't, he had to do it through these other kind of loopholes and mechanisms, right? So one of the big compromises that Obama and the Republican leadership at the time constantly told him, we don't believe Democrats are for securing the border. Democrats are weak on immigration enforcement. If you want us to pass any legalization program, you have to show us that you're tough on enforcement, right? And Obama, was in support of comprehensive immigration reform. He said, he later on came out against the wall when he actually visited the southern border and saw what the walls were doing. He said, okay, I'm against walls. But, nonetheless, he doesn't talk about it in his memoirs, but, whatever it is, he ended up going along with Republicans on immigration enforcement, specifically with regards to deportations, as we all know, right? And earning him the name of the deporter in chief, right? With the Republican Party always saying, this is not enough, you got to do more. And in the end, never giving him what he wants. So either Obama was naive, to believe that Republicans would come on board and eventually support a comprehensive bill that included both enforcement and a path to citizenship, or in reality, he really believed in that and really was supportive of immigration enforcement. The main difference between the three presidents that you asked about, Bush and Obama and Trump, is that all of them have, I guess the similarity is that enforcement basically has increased steadily since 9/11. Deportations dropping slightly under Trump, but they were replaced by detention, which obviously helps the prison industry a lot. Right, but enforcement is key. That's basically been shooting up since 9/11. I think the one difference is that Obama did put a lot of money into into naturalization programs for legal immigrants, legal permanent residents. He passed DACA. He also, didn't pass, but he issued DACA. He also issued DAPA, which would have legalized even more youth and parents of undocumented youth, right? So there was more of a kind of mixed bag of it, but I would say the one kind of unifying policy that we see is definitely one of enforcement, right? Which Trump has taken to a whole new level.
Great, thank you for that. So building off of those three presidents, with President Biden set to assume office in January, what do you expect to see about immigration policy under Joe Biden, and sort of what do you hope that President Joe Biden can achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect much just because, he's not going to have the 60-proof Senate, a bulletproof majority in the Senate or supermajority in the Senate that you need to pass anything, right? So although the House has become much more progressive than it was in the past, and one sign of that is that they were actually willing to help, to shut down the government to block Trump from building his border wall, right? So it tells you ideologically the House Democrats have shifted in the more kind of pro-immigrants, that you had so many senators come out in support of abolishing ICE, for example, which again was a pretty new police force. But you don't have that in the Senate. The Senate, it tends to be more conservative, and depending on what happens, even in Georgia's Senate race, he's still not going to have a 60 senators to vote with him on this. So I don't expect any major immigration reform. He's going to have to tweak things, policy things on the side, right? Like Trump was doing, right? So he's in charge of the bureaucracy. He could easily, kind of cut down on deportations even more. He could, redirect ICE and how they use their resources. He could limit detention. He has the power to do what the American people want. We just conducted a survey, and the vast majority of Americans, including the majority of Republicans, do not believe that children should be put in cages. It should not be intentionally. The majority of Americans, including Republicans, believe that migrant children should be released to sponsors and or family members, right? So he doesn't have to. He could do things like not separate families, things like releasing migrant children to sponsors and family members. So I think we'll see things like that. We could see him invest and try to make citizenship or naturalization less expensive. All right, he could promote citizenship drive. So I think you'll see things like that. I don't think we should expect any major reforms. I think he'll continue to support, border militarization, in just different ways, right? You won't see a symbolic wall. He'll spend more money on like drones and sensors and things like that, what they call smart border technologies.
That makes sense. And you mentioned the fact that most Americans don't support putting kids in cages and are in favor of path to citizenship. So building off that, what do you think the future of immigrant rights activism is, and sort of immigrants' role in the current very socially active climate?
Yeah, I mean, I think one lesson that we learned was that as limited as the Democrats are, right, is that oftentimes, when you're out of power and you don't have political power, the immigrant rights movement doesn't have a lot of formal political power. When you're out of power, one of the best things you could hope for is to choose who your enemy is, right? And we know that we're more successful fighting and organizing against Democrats than we are under Republicans. We've gotten 0 victories and nothing but constant attacks almost on a weekly basis by the Trump administration, right? Nonetheless, it doesn't mean there's no difference between the two political parties. Immigrants and Latinos might not be the determining vote in presidential elections, but as we saw here, especially in states like Arizona and Nevada, they're definitely a major contributing factor, right? The fact that Arizona flipped is huge. That was powered by the Latino immigrant vote and immigrant rights movement activists that for years have been naturalizing and registering people to vote there, right? So little by little, they're getting more influence there, but I don't think it's, I think they have a tough, the immigrant rights movement is in a tough situation where they have to constantly be paying attention to electoral politics now, because we saw how horrible it could be under Trump, and trying to get progressive Democrats elected. And then once they're elected, pushing them, right? Pushing them in the right direction, right? Because, the truth of the matter is a lot of Democrats often that get elected, they're in places that have zero immigrants. Immigration is not a direct issue, to a lot of Americans, especially in rural America. All right. The only thing they know about immigration is the scary things they see on Fox News, right? Or, these fake, TikTok and YouTube videos that someone sends to them. All right. So it doesn't, if there's anti-immigrant sentiment in their local districts, it doesn't make sense for these Democrats to come out being super pro-immigrant because there's no immigrant vote there, right? They gain nothing from it, right? Which I think is frustrating for Democrats on the West Coast and in urban cities, saying, hey, we're all supposed to be pro-immigrant. And they're like, well, yeah, that's nice for you, but I'll lose to a Republican, on this issue that doesn't even affect my constituents, if I come out too progressive on it, right? So I think Democrats have learned that it's not just getting the supporting the Democratic Party, it's getting the right Democrats in office. And then once they're in office, figuring out how to influence them and push them in the right direction. The Arizona case is another great example of the combination of investment in grassroots organizations, of them investing millions of dollars into voter registration, citizenship drives, naturalization drives, citizenship drives, to build an immigrant electorate, to build a pro-immigrant, pro-Latino a voting electorate, right? But that's stuff that takes a lot of money and a lot of time, right? So whether the Democratic Party and liberal foundations are committed to that kind of long-term strategy is yet to be seen. So far that we know, they tend to see things as investing in elections. They don't really invest in long-term movement building to their own, I guess, peril or risks, right, in terms of what we know works when it comes to organizing immigrant communities.
That is very interesting how different Democrats in different geographies have to approach immigration in different ways. And I think a similarly polarizing topic in America and within Democratic Party is defunding the police. And you mentioned earlier how being an undocumented immigrant is really just a civil violation. And you mentioned in Professor Rose's lecture a little bit about crimmigration and the criminalization of being an undocumented immigrant. So can you talk a little bit about what crimmigration is and how that sort of ties into America's broader reckoning with the criminal justice system right now?
Sure. It's the idea that immigration law and criminal law are starting to kind of fuse, right? The way that, cities, states have all tried to criminalize just the existence of migrants through, things like anti-day labor ordinances, programs like 287G, which allows police officers to kind of question people's immigration status, lets them work with ICE once people are arrested, for not stopping at a stoplight and they're in prison. So oftentimes these county sheriffs and police departments have agreements with ICE where then they'll turn them over to immigration officials. This is the whole sanctuary, kind of a lot of the sanctuary movement and debates, cities and states debates are about, right? So it's kind of this fusing of immigration law with criminal law, which again helps it, solidify, the minds of Americans. When you think immigrant, think criminal, right? Things that would never lead to the banishing of any American lead to the banishing and potential deaths of Latin American immigrants when they're arrested, right? And so it's and in response, similar to the defund the police, immigrant communities and Latino communities have their own version of that for years now with the whole abolish ICE movement, right? It's a similar kind of phenomena, this kind of policing that's violent, that destroys families, that destroys people, right? So, and the Latino community has a long history of anti-police brutality movements and activism, right? But in our contemporary day, that's taking the form of immigration police, right? So you see this kind of pushback against ICE, which again, it's something that was recently created. It was very, very created after September 11th. It didn't exist before. We might find it hard to believe that our entire detention system policy was at one point abolished, right? We basically did not have a detention system in the United States, partly because Republican President Eisenhower, the Supreme Court, and politicians at the time thought this is ridiculous. These people are trying to be American. They're contributing to the economy. Why would we put them in a prison? You know, while they're going through the proper channels of trying to migrate here, right? So, right, a lot of these things, these policies, we have to remember, are created by people and by parties and individuals, right? And they could be unmade and uncreated by the same type of people that are in these positions of power today.
Great. So we've mostly talked about immigration within the US, but I want to shift a little bit to more of the international focus. Can you talk about how United States trade policies, specifically NAFTA, for example, or anything else you can think of, affect the communities in Latin America and contribute to the immigration that we see to America?
I mean, yeah, there's just tons of ways. You know, if we talk about Mexico, for example, we could talk about the fact that, you know, for decades, you know, the United States controlled all the resources, the mining, the silver, the lumber, the banking system of Mexico and the Mexican economy, right? So you kind of have this indirect, like what we call like an economic imperialism for the entire history of the Mexican nation. You know, most countries, for example, when you build your infrastructure, your transportation infrastructure, like trains, for example, they're meant to connect the country. If you look at Mexico's kind of initial train and railroad infrastructure, it was literally built to take out resources and to come straight up to the United States, right? So, and then, you know, the United States has invaded Mexico about 5 times. It took half of the country of Mexico in 1848. Right, so there's this long history of U.S. imperialism, you know, and NAFTA is, I guess, just a more recent kind of version of that, where you know, we take the United States knows that there's a corrupt narco state or Mexican government. You know, you cut a deal with them that you know is going to hurt their own people, right? But you lock them into economic ties with the U.S. that allows the U.S. to flood Mexico, for example, with subsidized agricultural products in the US, and then floods Mexico with these cheap products that completely undermine their domestic industries and displace millions of people. So, for example, before NAFTA was passed, like every state, you know, you get our top economists and to look at it and be like, hey, if we pass this law, what will be the effects on our economy, right? And US government studies that were produced and published by the United States government said, if you pass NAFTA, Mexico agrees to it, millions of Mexican rural peasants will be displaced from the land. And most likely millions of Mexican migrants will be forced to come to the United States. Well, knowing that, and NAFTA was mostly negotiated and designed under the first President Bush, and then ultimately signed by Clinton. But both political presidents at the time thought like, well, you know, there's pros and cons to every trade policy, and we think it's worth it, right? I don't think it's a surprise that right after NAFTA was passed, Democrats and Republicans, under the leadership of Republicans in Congress, passed border militarization policies, right? So we wanted free trade for goods and corporations, right? But we wanted to at least symbolically tell the American people, oh yeah, we know people are coming and we're going to try to stop them, all right? So a lot of these symbolic measures like walls and other things, right? So yeah, there's a direct connection between our kind of neoliberal economic policies and economic restructuring that we pressured Mexico into because of the debt that it owed the United States, you know, and leading up to even today. And there's other direct ways, right? Central America, there's not a coincidence that we didn't have Central American immigrants to any real large degree in the United States until the 1980s, right? Big surprise. That's the same exact time that the United States government under President Reagan was undermining democratically elected governments in Central America because they were considered to be dangerous because of their leftist politics. All right, so we were funding revolutions and the overthrowing of democratically elected governments, and we have a long history of doing this in Latin America, but we were doing it in the 80s in Central America. This is what the whole Iran-Contra scandal was about, right? So you had, we were not only funding and arming the Central American militias and armies to kill their own people, we were also training them on how to do it, right? So if you look into, for example, what was once called the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, we would bring Central American soldiers and train them in torture tactics. We would train them on targeting specific subversive populations, and which included union organizers, students, and Catholic priests. Right, so we have a direct involvement in the destabilizing of Central Americans, of the forced migration of them. And then again, the most recent example being under the Obama administration, when there was a coup in Honduras, and the United States was the first and for a while the only country to acknowledge this illegal coup and to accept it, right, which installed a right-wing dictator basically in Honduras. And since then, we've seen this huge spike in violence in Honduras, including against LGBT migrants, right, forcing them to flee their country. So, when we talk about a few years ago, the asylum crisis at the border, these are people that are coming from Honduras, the same country, right, that we've been destabilizing, right? So it's like if somebody, the idea that we're going to make them, block them and force Mexico to block them over there in their southern border, and if not, we're going to block these asylum seekers here. People are seeking legally asylum, right? It's kind of like lighting somebody's house on fire and then boarding up the doors and the windows so that they can't get out, and then saying, oh, it's your fault, we can't let you in, so that's basically what the United States has done to Central America and Honduras in particular, right? So U.S. foreign policy has historically and continues to play a major role in the current issues of immigration.
Absolutely. That's all the questions I prepared for you. Thank you for the very informative answers. And I thought that house on fire metaphor was very powerful. But I would now like to open it up to questions and comments, conversations to anyone. Feel free to unmute yourself. There's only a handful of us here, so you can post in the chat or feel free to unmute and ask Professor Zepeda-Millán whatever your questions may be. Isabel, would you like to start us off? I saw that you messaged me that you have a question.
Sure. So I was just wondering, you touched briefly on the, sorry, my dog's freaking out. Frankie, no. He hates ice. I was thinking that you were talking about, touched briefly on the Abolish ICE movement. And I was thinking, the defund the police movement has been in the news a lot lately, and Abolish ICE has often been sort of shrugged off as something that's wild, even though it's a totally new phenomenon. So I guess I was wondering, given the epic kind of myth making surrounding DHS and ICE in general, what would need to happen in our in America, like, to make abolishing ICE politically feasible? Like, what are the next steps to make that less of like seem like a less radical thing, I guess?
Yeah, right.
That makes
sense. A lot of
sense.
it is the framing, right? Americans, yeah, no, I get it. A lot of it is the framing, right? You could, with a lot of these agencies, right, you could say abolish, which might appeal and excite folks on the left. You could say defund, which again, might mobilize and excite people who already agree with that, right? Other folks, you could get to the same outcome in some respects by calling it, I think Julian Castro in his presidential campaign, he called for kind of the transformation of ICE, right? Which basically would kind of, shrink it down, take policing powers away from it, right? Not, hold people in detention, do like we used to do, where, most of these people want to stay here permanently and they don't want to live undocumented. Most of these asylum seekers, have legitimate claims, and a vast majority of them show up, something like 80–90% show up to their court cases, right? So, letting them go, and then coming back, offering them legal services like we've done before in the past with other migrant groups, right? So, you could call it transforming, but you're basically still taking these kind of abusive police powers away from them. As I said before, we basically defunded the equivalent of ICE before, about 100 years ago in American history, where technically in the books we still had detention, but we had shut down. Ellis Island was our first detention center and a federal detention center. We shut it down. There was no use for it because we thought it was inhumane to be caging people, who hadn't committed any crimes, right? So I think there's different ways you could kind of do that. If you don't want to freak out, folks in the middle, you could kind of change the priorities. Historically, the United States government has purposely underfunded the Border Patrol, purposely underfunded border enforcement because they wanted the labor, right? So there's been times, like, for example, in California, where we know that, the vast majority of immigrants, farm workers are undocumented. We know how important they are to feeding the country. I think the pandemic has shown us that more than anything, right? Big surprise, President Trump has not called one immigration raid in the California farm fields where he knows that almost all of them are undocumented. All right. There has been time throughout American history when you've had like one immigration agent for the entire state of California in charge of checking, employers to make sure their workers are all, here legally, right? That's basically a way to kind of take away any enforcement powers for an agency by quote unquote like defunding it, right? Or making its priority really low, right? So there's different ways you could kind of go about doing it, right? I think for those of us on the left, we just kind of don't want these things to exist at all, right? Because the trick is if the infrastructure is still there, right, it also leaves the possibility of the next administration in power to really do it, right? So I think that there's pros and cons, but there's different ways I think you could impact or try to get at least close to the same outcomes in terms of defunding or abolishing some of these different police agencies.
It's interesting. Thank you very much.
I was going to ask about, so there's this whole conversation about path to citizenship and that how there isn't one practically for all of these people compared to other countries and that have very different systems. Canada, for example, is one in which it's far from perfect, but things are, it looks very different. There's a lot of opportunities that are much more accessible for more people than they are here. So if this were, and like you said, it's unlikely because of the Senate, but if this were to be passed in some way, how do you envisage this would work?
I mean, well, there's different ways, right? So first of all, it's important to know that as bad as our immigration laws are, this is the one thing we're better at in terms of policy than Europe. Most of Western Europe has really, really repressive and even more restrictive immigration policies than the United States, right? And partly because they don't have the same myths and histories of identifying as a country of immigrants, quote unquote, right? So yet, nonetheless, you're starting to see the development of migrant rights movements over there, except over there, a lot of the immigrants are African and Middle Eastern and South Asian, right? So it looks different, but it's still nonetheless, they kind of look at the United States for our organizing models in terms of the immigrant rights movement, but much more repressive. In terms of the US, it's also important to know that we've given something like 4 or 5 different amnesties to white illegals, right? And I say that term on purpose, white illegals, because I know that doesn't sound right? It's a little confusing because which tells us the way we've racialized the issue of illegality as being somebody brown, being a Latino person. But for most of American history, a lot of the quote unquote illegals were white, were European immigrants. And yet we found it in our hearts of Americans to continuously give them multiple amnesties, which May Nye documents wonderfully in her book, Impossible Subjects, right? So at one point we just said, okay, pay a fine. Another point we said, okay, everyone go to the Canadian border and then come back and we'll give you papers when you come back. Right? We had all these different mechanisms to legalize these white illegals. Right? So there's different now, it's a little different to pass a mass legalization or immediate citizenship. You do need Congress. But I think there's technically, Trump found tons of loopholes and said, just sue me and, and I'll see if I want or if I didn't, right? So one of the potential loopholes going around being discussed right now is the possibility of granting, all, right now that we're basically at a net zero in terms of undocumented people coming to the United States. There is no illegal immigration flood or wave coming. It was basically zero, but Trump ironically entered office. We had hit the all-time lows there. But, I think right now there's been some discussion of granting the, 7 to 10 million undocumented workers that we have here in the country, some type of it's called TPS, temporary protective status, similar to what we do with refugees at the time, which will then would legalize them, you know, not making them citizens, but potentially would in the future have a path to citizenship. You know, I don't know if the Biden administration has the guts to do it, given how close the election was, and given that there's another election coming in 2 years. And nonetheless, you know, that's, I think, one possible way. I think he's going to definitely, you know, secure DACA, you know, and help, you know, better fund that. The problem with, if you try to pass it legislatively when Republicans are a little bit more willing to support legalization, is that for them, they understand the long-term repercussions of being anti-Latino immigrant, right? So, you know, there was discussions even back under President Bush where Republicans are like, okay, fine, you know, we want the cheap labor, you want these people to have rights, you know, so we'll give you a path to citizenship, but why the hell would we want to create 11 million new Democratic voters? You know, because we know they're going to all vote Democrat as soon as we give them citizenship because of how we've been treating them, right? So they had to compromise on the compromise, right? So they said, okay, fine, we'll accept the path to citizenship, but I believe like it was in 2008, the last kind of serious proposal it was something like a 13 to 15-year path to citizenship, all right? Being like, okay, we're gonna delay the political impact of how we've been treating undocumented people as long as possible, you know, knowing that the, you know, a good chunk of them, maybe even at least half of them, probably wouldn't even take the final steps of getting citizenship, would be kind of fine just being legal permanent residents, right? Because again, these people come here to work, right, to feed their families, right? So yeah, I think it's a tough, I mean, the Republican Party has moved further to the right than the Democratic Party has to the left, which I think really kills any chance of a major legislation happening in any time soon, until there's a political consequence to it, until Republicans know we're not going to win on this issue. And unfortunately, Trump showed them you could win, and you could win the White House on this issue, right?
I've got a question. I think looking at some of the numbers we've seen from the 2020 election about Hispanic voters, especially in Florida and Texas, I'm curious, just do you feel, and in what ways do you feel the Democratic Party is ignoring and shortchanging Latino voters from electoral strategy, from a strategy outside of what I think some politicians see as bread and butter issues for Latinos? Like, where do you think the disconnect is, if that makes sense?
Yeah, this election is really, really tricky. All right. So one, I think it's important to point out, despite all the media hype, to look at what percent of Latinos have voted for Democratic presidential candidates the last couple of presidential elections. And you'll see that from Clinton, if you compare Clinton's first election, Bill Clinton's first election, Obama's first election, Hillary Clinton's campaign, and Joe Biden, each one of those Democratic presidents got between 66 and 68% of the Latino vote. So the Democratic Party did not lose the Latino vote in terms of the percent of Latino voters that they got. Where the Republicans gained, right? Because that's what everyone's looking at. Right? Everyone's looking at, oh, look, Trump had something like 18 and now it's up to like 22% or 25%, right? Where the Republicans gains was for those non-Latino Democratic voters. People who maybe voted for everything else, but then didn't vote Republicans, people who maybe voted Libertarian, right? That's where the Republican Party was drawing from, right? So I'm not surprised that Latinos in Florida voted. They've always voted. The majority, the biggest Latino group there are Cubans. The vast majority of Cubans are Republicans historically. That's changing to a large degree. Obama was able to win Florida. I think the majority of Latinos though still voted for Biden. It just wasn't by as big of a margin as they did for Hillary. I might be wrong on that, but I know that definitely the majority of Cubans voted Republican. But even if you look at second and third generation Cuban voters, they're trending more Democratic than their parents and grandparents. But Florida wasn't a surprise just because that's like the home of conservative Latinos. Texas is more surprising, Texas and Arizona, especially Texas, because historically Texas has had a much more conservative Latino population. They also have a way more violent, right? We had rates of Mexican lynchings in Texas that were just as high as lynchings of African Americans in the South, right? So the history of Latinos in Texas has always been a kind of violent and repressive one, which ironically or interestingly, which is different from California, instead of it creating like a negative backlash, where it leads to progressive politics, you kind of see more of a respectability type of politics happening there historically, which has been changing though with the increase of Latino immigration to Texas, right? So we've gone from thinking Texas is gone, solid Republican state forever, that these demographic changes are looking closer. Republicans are winning the presidency in Texas by less and less every year, right? This election, though, I started off by saying it's tricky because we know historically Democrats out-register Republicans during election years. And we know historically the best way to get people out to vote, especially Latinos and especially Democratic voters, is through door knocking, having what we call a field game, right? This is the one huge advantage that the Republicans have because, they don't believe in the COVID and the coronavirus. So they were out there registering people, they were knocking on doors. The Democrats literally had to run a campaign based on TV ads, right? So I'm a little hesitant to make any major generalizations of what this outcome was because I don't think we really saw the Democrats use their strongest. I mean, they were able to win without using their strongest tool, which was grassroots organizing and mobilizing by unions and community organizations, right? The one place we did see that grassroots organizing happen is Arizona, and we see the results. They were able to flip a Senate seat, right? And for the first time in I don't know how long, win the state. For the Democrats, right? So I think we'll know more in like the next presidential election when it's a regular election to see. We'll get a better sense of where Latino voters are trending. But my guess is that the Democrats, after seeing that Latinos were able to flip Arizona, and I think hopefully if they're smart, they'll start investing more in kind of the ground game and the institution building, the long-term institution building that you need in places like Arizona and Texas.
I was wondering, I feel like sometimes a lot of the language of like looking for immigration reform, I mean, kind of because they have to debunk myths about, immigrants are criminals or, all of these things. Sometimes that language ends up reinforcing either like model minority ideas or reinforcing, like, well, these immigrants aren't criminals, but jailing criminals or keeping other adult humans in cages is okay. I was wondering if you could like talk about that or if that comes up in your work at all.
Yeah, I mean, these are all kind of tough decisions, right? These are decisions that vulnerable populations kind of don't have the privilege on being woke in every single one of their framing and demands, right? When you're constantly getting attacked, right, and someone saying you're a terrorist, and this is why we're hitting you and beating you, saying I'm not a terrorist, I think to me at least it's really hard to demonize someone for saying that. Nonetheless, right, I think a lot of people who study discourse and framing, especially academics, will read into it and be like, wow, the fact that you're saying you're not a terrorist implies that someone out there is, right? And that in turn, it makes it pretty easy to criminalize people like Muslim and Arab terrorists, all right, which is technically possible, right? I think, but more so than kind of critiquing, these desperate immigrants that are being attacked and being called criminals and terrorists, I think it's important for us to, point the possibility of this out, but also understand the power dynamics in which those frames and those claims are being made, right? So I think it's, language is always super tough, right? We saw it with the BLM, right? That frame, Black Lives Matter, super clear to people on the left, right? Yes, they have to say Black Lives Matter because the fact of the matter is they don't matter to this country and they never have, right? So the point of them saying Black Lives Matter is to tell us, hey, all your lives already matter, ours don't, right? But that framing, while it was good to mobilize a certain base, also was open to critique, to confusion, right? You saw good-hearted, I think often Americans are like, wait, all lives matter, don't they? And they include Black lives in that, but then there's this debate of it, right? Saying like, no, that's not the point. You're kind of decentering Blackness, which was really important at the time to do and always, right? So I think social movements, all of them have frames, and sometimes your frames could be really successful at mobilizing your base, right? But maybe not that successful at convincing the people in power or other people you need to, right, to get what you want done. So it's really tricky, when it comes to social movements. And there's a whole scholarship and literature on framing and frame resonance, right? And it's, most activists are not linguists, they're not, they don't kind of think. And, Black Lives Matter started as a hashtag, and then ended up as an actual physical social movement on the streets, right? I'm not sure the people who started the hashtags were thinking about all these things, right, beforehand. But yeah, I mean, language is always difficult. It's easy to twist it. It's easy to demonize it. Yeah, nonetheless, I think it's important that when people do get called out, and I think the immigrant rights movement has tried to do this, is they make it very clear, like, no, we don't agree with the criminalization of our Arab and Muslim sisters and brothers either, right? That's not what we mean, so yeah, it's a tough one.
So we have about 5 minutes left. If anyone we have time for maybe one final question. If anyone has anything left, if not.
I'll just hop in with one last question. I was wondering how you think COVID-19 has affected your work in immigration policy more broadly, if you think it's kind of closed this window of opportunity to make meaningful change, or if you think that alternatively, because it's not like the most controversial issue in the news right now, that we could actually form coalitions or make progress on this issue. So interested to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, COVID is interesting. I think the media is not really picking up on it. I know the immigrant rights movement has been really trying to get this issue out in the media more, but the idea that the entire country right now is only eating because of immigrant labor, most of which is undocumented, from Florida and California in the Midwest. Right, and I don't think we've been successful in making Americans realize, if you go out, you have a chance of getting sick and dying. Right, over about 300,000 or more Americans have died because of this. Your ability to order in, your ability to still have groceries. Well, undocumented immigrants are not sheltering in place. They're risking their lives to feed you. All right, and unfortunately, we're going to have gone through this whole pandemic with vaccines and everything, and most Americans not accept that fact as well, the reality that they only survived the pandemic because of the exploitation of undocumented labor. All right, so. Given that, I don't think most Americans realize it and see that. And I don't think, given the fact that even throughout the pandemic, President Trump has continuously found ways to attack immigrants, I think shows that the Republican Party has not budged at all, that there is no possibility for any coalition with them. Right, they only want to further pass even more restrictive immigration laws and policies. Trump knows he lost the election. He's, speeding up border wall construction. Right, they're trying to strip more immigrants who are here legally from their legal status. Right, he's, and the Republican Party is terrified of him. The fact that they're so quiet right now, even the fact that Republican judges after Republican judges are throwing out all the voter fraud cases, and that the Republican Party and leadership is quiet about it and not telling him, forcing him to just step down, in terms of his rhetoric and admit he lost, tells you that they're still scared. They're scared of his base. Go back and look at the Republican primary debates and interviews of all the current Republican leaders leading up to 2016. They were warning the country, Trump is a racist. Trump is crazy. Trump will ruin and hurt the Republican Party for decades. All right. Now they're all quiet because they realize, holy shit, our base of voters are xenophobic, crazy racists who follow and fall for all these nutty conspiracy theories, and their primary leader is Trump. So they're scared of President Trump, so I doubt they're going to do anything controversial, like potentially come out with any compromise on immigration when, that's Trump's bread and butter issue. If it wasn't for COVID, this whole election would have been about the border wall and Trump's immigration policies.
Great, so it is just about 5, so I think we can stop here. Thank you again, Professor Zepeda-Millán, for joining us. I've certainly learned a lot, and I think you've given us all a lot to think about. I really appreciate you coming to this Policy for the People event. Yeah.
Great, thanks for the invitation. Have a good day.
Thank you.